students in 2 different panels. So a little background on the capstone course. 16 students were selected last fall, and over the last semester, they all picked a specific subject, developed a research question, developed their topic, wrote a literature review, found out where the gaps in their research was, traveled down to Colombia, did firsthand interviews with a number of different experts so that they could finish writing their capstone paper. Now, the objective of this class is threefold. The first one is to write their capstone requirement for capstone paper, which is a requirement so that they can graduate next month. The second one is also get a general deep familiarity with Colombia, aside from just their specific research topic. And then the third one is to learn how to lead, plan, and organize an international delegation of researchers, in this case themselves. They all came together, collaborated, set up all the meetings, and did all of their research firsthand, and coordinated everything. So what we're doing today is their opportunity to share what they found in their research. We're going to start off with 2 different panels. The first one right now is the security and conflict panel. And then afterwards, we'll do the human rights and politics panel. Plan for the panel is each one of the presenters or panelists will present what their research was about and what some of their findings were for about 10 minutes. So they'll all go with 10 minutes of introduction. And then after that, we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. If no one asks them a question, then I'll ask them really, really hard questions. So help them out, yes, please. So we have a really interesting first set of panelists today. First, we'll start off, again, it's security and conflict. We'll start off with Scott, who's been researching the resiliency of Clan del Golfo, followed by Hunter, who will talk about illicit mining, followed by Michael, who's going to be talking to us about negotiations with criminal organizations. And then finally, we'll end up with Bree in this panel, who'll talk to us about U.S. security assistance and civil relationship in Colombia. Like I mentioned before, they'll all present for 10 minutes, followed by Q&As. One thing I do want to note is this is all independent research from each one of the panelists. They've done this on their own. This does not represent the thoughts or viewpoints of any of the organizations they may or may not be working for, or they may or may not be working for in the future. This is just purely empirical research for the sake of all of our knowledge. We do have refreshments in the back, so please go ahead and enjoy some refreshments as we move forward with the panel. So starting with you, Scott. Go ahead. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
I want to thank you all for being here. As Professor Marquardt mentioned, each of us traveled to Colombia with a specific research question in mind. Mine related to the Clan del Golfo, or as they refer to themselves, the Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, or the Gaitanistas for simplification and clarity. And my question was specific to the organization's resiliency against the Colombian state and other competitive criminal organizations. So with that being said, we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So I will briefly be covering the organization's history, the structure that it's made up of, its current territorial reach. We'll look at some of the financing advantages the group has vis-a-vis both the state and other non-state armed actors. Finally, we'll look at how the organization represents and governs the regions under its control. And then we'll look at violent competition vis-a-vis both the state and other non-state armed groups. Next one, thank you. So just to go through briefly, I want to keep myself within the time frame. The organization that is now the Gaitanistas was really born in the late 1980s when a man named Fidel Castaño formed a small group known as Los Tangueros in Urabá as a result of his father being kidnapped and murdered by FARC combatants. That group quickly spread from a kind of hybridization of paramilitarism and banditry into full-fledged paramilitarism when it became the ACCU in 1994. At that point, it was spreading outside of the initial region in Cordoba that you can see up there into Antioquia and taking more territory and growing into a multi-thousand member organization. We go to the next slide. And from the ACCU and another organization that the Castaño brothers helped form, known as Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, they formed what became the AUC, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. This was the paramilitary group that a lot of people have in this room have probably already heard about, that grew to be the dominant non-state armed actor in Colombia. They enjoyed extensive ties to the military, to Congress, all the way up to the executive. But from the beginning, they had institutionalized some of those illicit economies that they inherited from both the ACCU, the Pepes, and los Tangueros. So much so that they became a national security threat to the state, and were on the receiving end of constant military operations, to the point where in 2003, the organization signed a demobilization accord. Unfortunately, while 30,000 members demobilized, not everyone did, and a lot of recidivism took place, which meant that you had what were known as bandas criminales, BACRIM, in roughly 2005. These were disparate organizations, but roughly a year later, you started to have a lot of them coalescing under one banner, the AGC or the Gaitanistas. And again, that is starting principally in the region that you see marked in orange, kind of the lighter shade of salmon, I guess, and spreading outwards to become the group we have today, the Clan del Golfo, which has a membership of roughly 4,000 to 9,000 members, depending on who you ask. The next one. Okay, so the structure of this organization is complicated. They get billed as a classic drug trafficking cartel. They are not. I believe they are much more akin to an Italian-style mafia group. What I mean by that is they are not purely operating on a business model, but also are engendering a sort of culture within the territories that they control. That is a culture of omerta, or basically an unwillingness to speak or collaborate with law enforcement or the Colombian state, because you view your ties to your region or your municipality as being preferential to that of your national ties. Additionally, they enjoy a regional identity. Every one of their leaders has been born in Urabá. They typically are not transplanting members or specific soldiers to different regions, and are using locals who know the community, know how the licit and illicit economies work within that region, and that's really helped them in terms of expansion. Again, as we saw in the previous slides, this is a group that has ties to Urabá and its greater territories since the 1980s, and is mixing truly an amalgamation of every possible version of Colombia's non-state armed actors that it can. Maoist left-wing insurgencies, right-wing paramilitaries, self-defense groups, obviously drug trafficking groups. And finally, I want to touch on the franchising or subcontracting model. This is not unique to the Gaitanistas, but it is unique in how effective they are at this. So they maintain either alliances or complete subjugation of groups throughout the country, not just in rural zones, but also in urban areas where they have a weaker kind of territorial influence. Basically, this relationship entails the local group signing on to kind of display the banners of the AGC, kick back a certain percentage of their profits in exchange for resource assistance, occasionally receiving mandates from the principals in Apartado and Necoclí, and in some cases receiving military assistance if the group is contested for its territorial space there. We'll go on to the next slide. So here we have the broader territorial reach of the organization today. This is coming to us thanks to Inside Crime and Pares. As you can see in the northwest of the country. That is kind of the heartland of the organization as it was going all the way back to the 1980s. But they are expanding south along the Pacific coast, trying to increase their reach into Nariño and get greater access to ports that allow them to move not just cocaine, but a whole host of illicit products out west. And at the same time, they're moving east with the intent to create a kind of completed corridor from the Caribbean Ocean all the way to, you can see the eastern department of Norte de Santander, where they have very minimal presence right now, but their goal is to eventually complete that corridor all the way to the Venezuelan border. Go to the next slide. Okay, so how are they doing this? This is to simplify it, but they are richer than every other non-state armed actor in the country. They are richer because they are operating not necessarily on the old school drug trafficking model of controlling every aspect of, let's say, the cocaine trade and being in charge of transportation themselves. They are much more akin to a Sicilian or Calabrian group, kind of backstamping the entire process, putting their name, their reputation behind it. That's helped them a lot, especially in the coca and cocaine industry, where their international reputation as being effective guarantors of contractual obligations means that during the coca crisis that is currently going on in Colombia, their territories are the only ones where they maintain solid coca prices for their growers. And that's really helped them maintain the estimated 3.3 billion that they receive in coca and cocaine revenues. Again, all of these are the principal kind of earners for the group, but in a lot of cases, this is something where they're operating much more behind the scenes and getting kicked back a percentage of the total profits. Go to the next slide, to criminal governance. So this is incredibly important, not just for this group, but for any group that operates on a territorial control model. So what they are doing different, however, is co-optation of elites. A lot of the less left-wing armed groups in the country are viewed negatively by the landed elites, especially in rural communities. The Gaitanistas enjoy really strong support, not only from local communities at times, although that obviously depends on the area and how much control they have, but in some cases there are reports of elites bankrolling the organization should a leader run out of cash and not be able to pay salaries. So that's very unique for a non-state armed group in the country. Again, they do maintain support. So as you can see, we have a quote here. This is actually from T-shirts that were passed out in Necoclí, the birthplace of one of the organization's former leaders, Giovanni, after he was killed. At the same time, it would be a complete oversimplification to say that they enjoy support everywhere they operate. They are absolutely employing coercion just as much, if not more so, wherein you will be forced into business with them or they will go with whoever remains after they've killed you. State connections, again, they do have kind of that residual connection from being a paramilitary organization, but they have not kept all of those kind of strong linkages to the state. It's more now at an ad hoc local level where they will have corrupted local government, obviously law enforcement and military officials, and specific port authorities that allow them to move their product out into, the US and European markets primarily. Next. Okay. This is essentially what they're up against. The Colombian state has been working diligently since really, since the group's inception, but I would argue most strongly since 2015, when the Colombian government initiated Operation Agamemnon 1. So this is just a snapshot of basically everything the group suffered between 2015 and 2018, where they lost 2,000 members. Roughly 53 of those were national level leaders. So it's not just kind of rank and file. Billions of dollars lost, lots of asset forfeitures. And as you can see over to the right, not only did they maintain their territorial presence through all that, they expanded. So the idea that this organization was broken by Operation Agamemnon 1 and 2 is untrue, but you can see there is somewhat of an effect. And currently we're in Operation Agamemnon 3, so jury's still out on how effective that will be. You can go to the next slide. A big caveat with Operation Agamemnon 3 is that because of Paz Total, they are really the only major group that's still being hit by the Colombian government. Most of the other larger non-state armed actors in the country are currently in ceasefire or ceasefire negotiations with the Colombian government. And the Gaitanistas are no longer being advantaged by that. So they are not only fighting this whole host of actors, they are also engaged in combat with the state. At a more local level, they still are battling the ELN, EMC, the Rastrojos for specific territory to make that eastward expansion that I mentioned earlier. But in all likelihood, I believe they will expand and make it into the Venezuelan territory, and it is my contention that their expansion will not be stopped by any one of these armed actors or the state. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
All right, go right into it. Hi, everyone. My name is Hunter. I'm going to be talking today about illicit gold mining in Colombia. Next slide. So why am I interested in illicit gold mining? It makes up about 80% of the gold that Colombia produces. So only 20% of all of the gold that comes out of Colombia is produced and legally, which is a massive figure in my mind. And at the same time, as Scott alluded to in his presentation, it's a major source of funding for pretty much every criminal group that is operating in Colombia. So around 2016, there were some reports that came out, and a lot of people cited this, that armed groups and criminal groups in Colombia started to receive more money from illegal gold mining than they did from cocaine exports. Others have debated that fact a little bit, but the fact of the matter is the two activities are deeply intertwined and complementary to one another. And in 2019, we had an estimate that criminal groups were earning at least 2.4 billion USD from illegal gold mining activities. It's widespread across the country. So you can see here sort of a heat map of where some of the areas most affected by gold mining are. These include the departments of Antioquia, Chocó, Bolívar, Nariño, and Cauca. And more than half of illicit mining takes place in protected areas, whether that is natural parks, environmental reserves, or indigenous reserves. Next slide. And illegal gold mining also has really detrimental environmental impacts. So you have widespread use of mercury, even though Colombia has technically outlawed mercury. Mercury trafficking appears to be really just as resilient as the trafficking of every other illicit commodity. So it's still widely used in illegal gold mining operations. And there's really damaging levels of mercury contamination in areas that are affected by illegal gold mining. At the same time, you have other really environmentally damaging techniques that are used, especially by criminal groups involved in gold mining, including dredging. So most illegal gold mining is happening as alluvial mining, which is in rivers. And you can see here a photo just from Twitter from Insight Crime, who was in Chocó. And this is areas that have been affected by dredging. And you can see the side of the riverbed here pretty much just completely destroyed. Next slide. So what was my research question? My research question was really to understand the factors that have contributed to the inability of the Colombian state to decrease the amount of gold that's produced illicitly. Sort of said another way, what are the factors that have led to really the resilience and pervasiveness of illegal mining as a criminal activity? Next slide, please. So to understand that, there's about 4 major points that I'm going to highlight. The first is the really complicated landscape you face when you talk about illegal mining and what that means. Second, we have the demand side factors that are pulling different individuals and groups into illegal mining. We have the challenges that the Colombian state faces when trying to address the issue of illegal mining. And then we have gaps in regulation and gaps in enforcement that is allowing different aspects of illegal mining to continue to operate. So next slide. we're going to start out by understanding sort of the legal, cultural, regulatory framework around illegal mining. So this is sort of to help answer the question, who are illicit miners? And the short answer is that it is not a monolithic group. So when we talk about the 80% of Colombian gold that is produced illegally, that figure describes a wide range of activities, going from subsistence or artisanal mining all the way up to complex criminal operations. And these different activities require vastly different responses from the state. So all mining activity takes place within the scales of illegality, informality, and criminality. So if we want to understand sort of what is illegal mining refers specifically to mining that's conducted with a proper mining title and that has the relevant environmental permits. So without either of those permits, no mining is completely legal. And would be considered illegal mining. So you might also have miners who actually do have a mining permit, but they're waiting on an environmental permit, or maybe have a mining permit but are conducting mining in an area that's not covered by that permit. And so technically that mining would be considered illegal. You then have informal mining, which sort of refers to a higher level of additional environmental, tax, and social compliance. So you can have legal mining that isn't completely formal if it's not getting reported to tax authorities properly, for example. And then you have criminal mining. And that is mining that is used to finance criminal activity or is conducted using criminal methods. So as I was mentioning before, dredges are used by a lot of criminal groups. They have sort of armed guards outside of them. These are really environmentally destructive, dig up the riverbeds. That would be an example of criminal mining. So the challenge here is adapting state responses based on the type of mining that's being conducted and differentiating between artisanal and criminal actors. And that can be a bit more challenging than it seems at times because you also have this mining taking place in places with really complicated dynamics where artisanal miners may be extorted or otherwise taken advantage of by criminal groups. And so separating those linkages sometimes is not as easy as it sounds. And then even when you're looking at criminal mining, you have to understand what is going on here. So there were 4 main typologies highlighted of the different ways criminal organizations are involved in mining and what's produced from that. So you have commodity laundering, when criminal organizations take gold that was produced illegally and try to pass it off as legal gold. You then also have money laundering happening when the proceeds of that illegal gold are laundered into the illicit financial system. You then also have narco trafficking groups who are using gold as a store of value because it is appreciating in value. It is less volatile than the Colombian peso, easier. It's very fungible, so you can transfer it to a lot of different currencies pretty easily. So it's used as a store of value. Then separately, you have the use of gold by narco trafficking groups as a way to launder funds from drug trafficking activity. And so while those 4 might all sound somewhat similar, they are distinct activities and require distinct responses from the state. So you have a really complicated environment when you're going here and saying, how do we address illegal mining? Next slide. So next, I'm going to talk about the demand side factors. Next slide. And the first is simple economics. And this is something that you can see in the literature, but I was actually surprised by the number of folks we talked to in Colombia that this was one of the first points they highlighted, was the pure economics and the fact that you have 2 ongoing trends in recent years, which is that gold has been appreciating in value and cocaine has been decreasing in value. And so there are a lot of incentives for groups who are involved in narcotics trafficking to diversify their criminal enterprises and also get involved in illegal mining. At the same time, you have to really understand the benefits of illegal gold, not just the profits that can come from it, but it is very hard to trace once it leaves its source, much easier to transport across borders, and it's one of the best ways for groups to launder their illicit funds. So not only do they seek to profit from illicit gold, but they also use it to help maintain their other operations and launder funds coming from those other operations. And last, you have unscrupulous buyers. So the gold mining itself isn't happening in a vacuum. You need to have someone down the supply chain who's willing to purchase this gold. And unfortunately, there are buyers and there are markets who are willing and able and ready to turn a blind eye to the sourcing of gold and how it's been produced. So this occurs both within Colombia and also in destination countries like the US, Panama, Switzerland, and Italy. Next slide. So I also want to cover briefly the challenges that are faced by the state when it's trying to respond to illegal mining. So next slide, please. In addition to sort of the complicated environment that I was describing, I wanted to dive into a couple more specific factors that have hindered the effectiveness of state responses. So first you have coordination challenges. As I mentioned previously, for mining to be formal, you have to have permits both from the Ministry of Mines and Energy and the Ministry of Environment. And frequently there is a complete lack of coordination and communication between these two organizations that can either delay the permitting of mining activity or might have someone, fully ready to go with one agency and be operating without the permitting from the other agency. At the same time, when you're looking at disrupting illegal operations, the military, who often is willing and able to identify or to go in and destroy illegal mining operations like dredges, has to coordinate with other agencies as well, including having at least two types of police present when they go into these operations, and that delays action as well. You also have challenges with the formalization process itself. So when you're looking at like informal mining or artisanal mining, the solution here is not disrupting that activity, but formalizing that activity. However, the framework in Colombia right now doesn't fully recognize sort of the nuance in a lot of artisanal mining. So it doesn't allow for miners who maybe are mobile with their mining operations to have the requisite permits to do that. And it also doesn't recognize some new techniques that have emerged, such as motobombas, which is basically a step above artisanal mining because it uses some level of mechanization, but is not environmentally harmful. But there's really no regulation around that. And there's weak incentive for miners to formalize right now. It's a labor-intensive process, costly process that most artisanal miners do not have the resources to do on their own. And at the same time, there's really no issue in bringing gold to market, even despite formalization. So there's few incentive structures right now that work towards formalization. You also have corruption. There are often embedded interests at the local level in local governments who profit or have direct interest in environmental crime. You also just have the sheer value and the amount of funds that are coming out of illegal mining and other environmental crimes, creating opportunities for corruption. And there's a specific sort of issue with corruption in the police. So a couple of people we talked to shared anecdotes about miners who maybe were trying to take their gold to market, driving it to a different city who are stopped by police. They don't have the paperwork for that gold. The police will seize that gold, but very rarely is that gold or seizure reported. The illicit activity continues and the police keep that gold. So corruption is a major issue as well. And then you have state-community relations that complicate some efforts to go after mining. So in the past, there have been issues that have arisen when, for example, the national government has given mining permits to most multinational companies without doing checks to see that there was already artisanal mining being conducted by local communities in the areas where these multinationals have been given permits to operate. That creates conflict and creates lack of trust between communities and states. At the same time, you basically have a tension between the need to sort of prevent crime and go after illegal mining operations with law enforcement, and the recognition that in many places that represents people's livelihood, and there are few alternative means of formal employment for those individuals. So bringing new employment opportunities to areas where illegal mining is prevalent is a major challenge. And lastly, we have international coordination, especially for mining happening in the Amazon region. They're porous borders. It's very easy for criminal groups to move their operations or move themselves across borders. And so you really need a regional approach. Next slide. And you can go one more as well. So I'm going to go quickly into the gaps in current government efforts. So rather than the challenges I was talking before, these are a couple different holes in current approaches. The first is a follow the money approach. So a lot of people that we spoke to while we were in Colombia mentioned the need to really switch focus to a follow the money approach that goes after higher nodes on the supply chain so that law enforcement efforts are targeting those who are profiting from the underlying crime and not just those who are conducting it. Even when the government is able to go in and destroy mining operations, that is not changing the underlying set of incentives and weak regulations that are allowing those operations to thrive. And there's still so many financial incentives for groups to just restart their operations after that happens. There is some sense that this is beginning to change. Colombia is like starting to move in this, but it's unclear exactly what's happening. But it is possible. There are very clearly defined typologies, for example, laundering through gold, where criminal groups will basically purchase the mining rights from Afro-Colombian communities, for example, who under law have the right to produce a certain amount of gold per year, then will take that gold that they produce illegally, pass it off as artisanal gold, and give it, sell it to gold brokers in Medellin. And those gold brokers are a relatively small community. It's known who they are, but yet little action is happening to target that level of the supply chain. Second is a lack of prosecution of environmental crimes. A number of people highlighted that this was an issue, that the government was not doing as much as it could to prosecute environmental crimes. And one thing that I found out recently that I thought was really interesting is that the Fiscalía General de Colombia has not successfully prosecuted a single case of money laundering via illicit gold. So there were 2 high-profile cases in recent years that the Fiscalía brought, but they were unable to get convictions on those cases. There are convictions at lower levels. This is just specifically money laundering via gold that hasn't been able to be prosecuted. But even as a more widespread issue than that, there are questions about even when the military is going in and disrupting operations, it's unclear how many people are actually getting arrested and getting charged with crimes. And so prosecution is a major issue. And then last but not least, we have financial inclusion. It is a major barrier to formalization. So most artisanal and subsistence miners do not have bank accounts, and it is very difficult for them to be fully integrated into formal networks without financial inclusion. The banks see miners as a very high-risk client, very low profitability with these clients, and there's a lot of barriers to getting these individuals integrated into the financial system. But without that, they can't bring gold to market formally. In Colombia, you can't buy gold in cash. You could also think, a chunk of gold about this big that you could carry in your pocket could be worth tens of thousands of dollars. So you can't be conducting all those transactions in cash. And so without that, individuals are reliant on intermediaries who are often connected to or potentially connected to criminal organizations who will buy that gold from them in cash and then take it to market. And they're also getting less than market value for that gold by not being able to bring it to market themselves. So that was the last thing I was going to highlight. I do have areas for future research, but over time. So if you have questions about that, we can talk about it in Q&A.
Thank you everyone for coming. So I'm sticking with the crime theme that we've had going on the panel so far, although I'm approaching it from a slightly different angle. The focus of my research is on the Colombian state's efforts to engage in negotiations with the Gaittanistas under the total peace initiative. Next slide. So really, why did I choose this topic? There's 3 reasons. First is just my general personal interest in the subject matter. I was an organized crime analyst prior to coming to SAIS, and one of my passion areas is understanding alternative mechanisms for addressing criminal violence. And going to Colombia to study this topic is very personally exciting for me. The second is that Colombia is a very relevant peace negotiation case study. The Colombia 2016 FARC peace accord is kind of the textbook example of a comprehensive peace agreement. And despite all the challenges it's had with implementation and obstacles from the political realm, it has given us a lot of lessons learned for how to conduct a good peace accord. But despite all the progress that's been made, there's a lot of factors that lead Colombia to being a conflict-ridden society. Including extreme inequality in urban-rural divides, porous border with its neighbor Venezuela, which Hunter mentioned, large amount of resources that have high demand on illicit economies like minerals and coca, as well as a long history of violent conflict that feeds into future conflicts between grievances. And then finally, total peace is kind of the hot topic in Colombia right now. Petro campaigned on a platform of bringing total peace to Colombia within his term of presidency. What that really means in practice has been unclear, but one of the hallmarks of the initiative is to expand the scope of peace accord negotiations in the country to include more criminal actors who were not necessarily part of the initial FARC-Colombia conflict that ended in 2016. Next question, or next slide, please. So in terms of my overall research question, I am focused on answering what factors have impeded the Colombian state from ripening the conflict with the Gaittanistas and engaging with the organization in productive peace negotiations. And the reason I chose to focus on the Gaittanistas specifically, as explained by Scott, the Gaittanistas are currently the strongest armed actor in Colombia. They're defined by law in Colombia as a criminal group, not an ideological political group. So they were historically a group that was excluded from negotiations, although Petro has made a commitment to changing that. And according to Colombia's Ministry of Defense, they're the only criminal gang in the country that is defined as a true conflict actor that contends with the state. One of the quotes we got from Insight Prime during our meetings was that you simply cannot have total peace without considering a group of the Gaittanistas. So understanding the feasibility of this negotiation process is critical to understanding the feasibility of total peace. And then finally, there's a timeliness to studying these negotiations. Actually, on our second day in Colombia, the Gaittanistas tweeted that they'd be willing to engage in the negotiation process. They had not had a formal negotiation channel set up before. We haven't seen a lot of progress in the last 2 weeks, so it's unclear if it's going to happen, but this literally happened during one of our meetings over in Colombia. So definitely a timely subject to be considering. Next slide, please. So in terms of the literature that's framing this paper, understanding criminal actors as a conflict actor is a relatively new field in conflict management literature. Only about the last 15 years have we seen a lot of academic literature about how these groups can be considered not just an internal governance problem, but actual conflict actors who can be negotiated and engaged in the same way that insurgencies, other organizations can be. There's a decent amount of literature about the strategies that states can use to address criminal organizations. The three main ones that I've used in the study are the accommodation, confrontation, and transformation toolkit, which essentially is accommodation is allowing for coexistence of criminal economies. Confrontation is the kind of typical war on drugs, militarized law enforcement strategy. And transformation is the attempt to use alternative strategies like negotiations to transform criminal organizations into more legitimate political organizations or institutions that can be kind of instituted into acceptable society. And really the gap that I'm trying to fill with this paper is an analysis of factors that make peace negotiations between the Colombian state and criminal organizations challenging through the lens of formal conflict management theory. There's a lot of organizations that have written about how the Colombian state should engage with the Gaitanistas, but not using some of the frameworks that are traditionally used in conflict management classes that we teach here at SAIS. So anyone who's taken a class with Vukovic is familiar. Oh, sorry, next slide. Anyone who's taken a class with Vukovic is familiar with ripeness theory. This is kind of the framing theory for how I make my argument in the paper. And basically, ripeness is a way of understanding when a conflict becomes negotiable. Essentially, a conflict is ripe for negotiation when two parties determine that there's a mutually hurting stalemate and that there's a way out. This essentially means that the two parties have determined the mutual perception that continuing to engage in a confrontation is not going to lead to the advancement of their interests. And the way out is the perception that there is an alternative strategy beyond conflict. So this could be a negotiation, this could be some kind of transitional justice policy, it could be amnesty. There's lots of different ways that ripeness can play out. There's a corollary to the theory about mutually enticing opportunities, which basically says that when the conflictual parties can find that there's common interest beyond just a way to find a resolution to their conflictual interests, you're more likely to get a successful outcome in the long term. The other kind of theoretical framework is the matrix of ideology versus representativeness of armed actors. I don't know how well you can see on this chart. I wish I had a laser pointer, but essentially Dean Pruitt wrote a paper in 2006 where he identified different armed groups by the degree to which they're ideological and the degree to which they're representative of the communities in which they operate, and found that the groups that are relatively low in ideology and relatively low in terms of representativeness and social capital are the hardest groups to engage in negotiations. And if you can see, the Gulf Clan, I think it's this Gulf Cartel in this chart, is listed in that kind of difficult to engage category in the bottom left. I would argue that since 2006, they've moved a little bit to the right and a little bit up in terms of their ideology and representativeness. They still represent the most challenging type of group to engage because the incentive structures for negotiation with criminal groups are just very challenging for a state to provide. Negotiating with a group and saying that you can lay down your arms and go to jail is not a particularly enticing offer to most people. So next slide, please. This is just a little bit of some of the meetings we had on the trip. We met with a pretty wide variety of organizations. You can see in green meeting with the special envoy from the UN for the UN verification mission. And pretty much all of these organizations had something to say about total peace because it's really kind of framing a lot of the conversation about security in Colombia. Okay, next slide. So in terms of some of the preliminary findings, in terms of what are some of the obstacles to negotiations with Gaitanistas, the first is really the structure and the nature of the organization, which Scott explained very well in this presentation. It's really unclear the degree to which the Gaitanistas have an ideology. They do appeal to this kind of solidarity with rural populations. It's not clear how much they actually believe that ideology, or this is an ideology of convenience that can be accompanied by the coercive tactics they use. The fact that they have a franchise model makes it very difficult to engage them as a unified body. Any negotiation with the main chain of command may exclude some groups who will then fill the void once the group has been dismantled. Another challenge is that the group will only accept a political dialogue. They will not accept a submission to the judicial system for the negotiation. And this is a major problem because for many people, this is viewed as kind of a legitimization of crime and total impunity for a group that has occupied a deviant position in society. And then a final factor in the structure nature of the Gaitanistas is the historical experience of many members of the group is one of not really trusting the state to hold its end of the bargain in negotiations. Many members of the group were parts of armed organizations that had demobilized during the 2016 peace accords, and then the economic opportunities and security guarantees that were supposed to follow were not put in place. Many of these people faced violent reprisals from rival organizations, and they ended up rejoining illicit economies because there was no other economic opportunity for them. Another factor is that there have been ripe opportunities before, perhaps, that were missed. Scott talked about Operation Agamemnon. There was a period of time where the Colombian government, with assistance from the US, was putting a lot of pressure on the Gaitanizas, and Toniel, who was the leader at the time, had offered up a willingness to negotiate. He was eventually arrested and extradited. And after this happened, the Colombian government, once Petro came into office, has kind of pulled back on their operations in the group. This has given them the time to kind of regroup, reconsolidate their power, and that's why we're not really seeing an improvement in the security environment with regards to the group thus far. And it's made a much harder bargain to negotiate with the group when they're in a stronger position today. Another factor is just the overambition of Paz Total. This has been a criticism since the beginning of the Petro administration. If you want to conduct negotiations with every single armed group in the country, you also have to broker ceasefires between them as well. Otherwise, you're not really solving any conflicts. There's a lack of willing mediators. One of the major, it's very difficult to get a mediator with any kind of capacity to platform a criminal organization that's not widely believed to have a political ideology that can be kind of mainstreamed in some way. So one of the key components of the FARC negotiations was that Cuba was willing to act as a guarantor for the FARC because of an ideology similarity between the two, which really helped to balance some of the asymmetries between the two parties at the negotiation table. No state or international actor is really willing to be the guarantor for the Gaitanizas. They have expressed a willingness to have the Catholic Church be a mediator. We may be able to see some kind of ceasefire negotiation if they were to become involved. The Catholic Church has been an active gang mediator in Latin America before, but it's very unlikely that the Catholic Church is able to kind of do this mainstreaming process that will cause a real exit from violence from the group. And then the final is the criminal power vacuum problem. It's kind of been addressed earlier in the presentation, but even if the negotiation went amazingly with the Gaitanizas and every single person laid down their arms and submitted to a judicial process and amnesty, other groups are going to fill the criminal void. So there's really a question of, is total peace possible if you cannot fundamentally transform society to have less income inequality and more opportunity? So this is kind of, oh, sorry, next slide. This is kind of the further research for me. I'm still working on kind of all the groundwork for this, but there's kind of two potential avenues for negotiations that have been laid down for the Colombian state to successfully engage. Dismantlement is the strategy that most organizations who have talked about this subject have kind of advocated for or seen as the most likely, which is where kind of piecemeal negotiations will be done to get lower level members of the organization to take amnesties, leave illicit economies, and kind of take new economic opportunities that are provided by the state when they extend state's capacity. This has to be complemented by some kind of enforcement action to ensure that there is actual incentive to leave this, because at present, there's not much of incentive to leave criminal economies currently. And this needs to be followed by comprehensive DDR and transitional justice policy like we saw in other gang negotiations. The kind of less likely and more controversial idea is the transformation or mainstreaming approach, which is trying to get the core or ideologically focused part of the group to agree to exit from illicit economies and from violent actions, but become legitimized as kind of a political body or advocacy group, kind of the way that the IRA was transformed to the Sinn Féin, or the FARC was transformed to a political power in Colombia. Because this is a primarily profit-driven group, it's very difficult to see this actually happening, and there need to be a pretty comprehensive justice system approach to rectifying many of the crimes that's committed. You can see on the left, I kind of created a tentative framework for how these negotiations could play out using the right response. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
You can just leave on this picture. I don't play the easy slides.
Okay.
Sorry guys, I'm going no slides. Hello, thank you guys for being here today, and thanks for your interest in the Latin American Studies program here at SAIS. Before we get started, just an honor to represent our institution in Colombia and to be a part of such a moving delegation. So this has been a really great experience, and thanks for being here today. My topic is about warriors' accountability to citizens, and I'm analyzing the United States' role in Colombia's contemporary civilian-military relations. So my research question was oriented around, does U.S. security assistance have a relationship to contemporary civil-mil relations in the country? And this is due to a kind of a personal interest of mine. I spent a summer with the Congressional Research Service studying the Senator Leahy War Victims Fund and just different US congressional initiatives to address war legacies in Southeast Asia, as well as being with the US mission in Timor-Leste, a country coming out of conflict, and a great example of peace and transitional justice. And I'm personally and professionally interested in bringing more human aspects to the strategic level of conflict and peace. And although this will be a very strategic level kind of presentation, it's just worth noting that no Colombian family has been untouched from the violence of this brutal 50-year civil war. So I hope to bring that human perspective into what we're talking about, especially on a technical level. So my hypothesis is that yes, US security assistance does have a very big impact on civil and military relations in the country at many different levels. And the way I kind of compartmentalize it is at the service chief level into the community level. And what I wanted to know from my research going on this trip is who holds the monopoly of violence in Colombia? How is the Colombian military perceived? And then what is the role of the United States in this calculation? So there's a lot of civil mil literature out there, particularly in the democratic context. For my framework I'm building it off of Clausewitz's Holy Trinity in strategic studies, that war is an extension of politics and using that kind of civilian governance model. So in this trinity, although I don't have a visualization of it, you have at the top policy, which is represented by the government, then you bring it down to the passion of the people, then the element of chance by the military. And in this trinity, you have a lot of fog, friction, hatred, and violence. So in that, the government formulates the political objectives, which are then executed by the military, and the people, in this case, provide the resources, manpower, support that's necessary for this effort. But the framework I'm building off is off the normative belief that civilian political control over the military is preferable to military control of the state. But it seems that the area of contention is in civil military is how civilian control over the military is established and maintained. And then, of course, in this particular situation, you have a whole other element, which is the role of external security assistance from the United States. So since Colombia has entered a peacetime effort, there hasn't been a lot of literature or research, academic research done on how this shift of civil-mil relations has occurred since the country has reached peace. Particularly analyzing, going back in history, looking at Plan Colombia, there's a lot of literature that suggests that security assistance can potentially erode checks and balances within civilian-military relations for political accountability. In addition, some of the other work too, I won't get into the weeds too much with it, but Charles Tilly and Max Weber's work of the monopoly of violence, given that nation states are responsible for the chief concentrated means of violence within a population and its territory. So they're responsible for holding executive control of coercive forces, including military and police, whether that's through means of taxation, conscription, administration, as Scott and Michael and everyone's kind of talked about, co-opting violent competition to establish state legitimacy. So in this type of framework, the state becomes the sole supplier of violence, coercion, or force, which often takes the form of bureaucratic and administrative institutions with the primary function of managing violent competition among its populace. In addition, looking at Sam Hunting's work on The Soldier and the State about subjective and objective control of the military, and then that kind of falls into the fusionist and concordantist theory, which is that domestic politics and culture are centered to civil-military relations. So bringing it into the Colombian case, so just to define and scope what I'm talking about, I'll be talking about U.S. security assistance to Colombia. I'll be talking about lines of effort within the Colombian government, and then how this impacts public perceptions of the state. So to define U.S. assistance, I'm personally looking at security assistance and cooperation, which are very much so mandated by Congress under the Title 10 and Title 22 authorization. So in the DoD's own words, security cooperation is interaction with foreign defense establishments to build defense relationships that promote specific U.S. security interests, develop foreign-friendly country military and security capabilities for self-defense and multinational operations, and provide U.S. forces with peacetime and contingency access to friendly foreign countries. Then we fall into security assistance, which is Title 22, which is also authorized by the State Department, the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act, in which the United States provides defense articles, military training, other defense services by grant, loan, cash sale, lease, and furtherance of national policies objectives. So to get into the nuance that I wanted to kind of discover in my time in Colombia and the evolution of the U.S. security cooperation relationship, after 200 years of diplomatic relations, Colombia remains the partner of choice in the words of many officials of which we've met. And and that Colombian security is the light footprint of our own national security here in the United States. Colombia is one of the largest, most well-equipped militaries in Latin America. They're the most competent and in addition are an exporter of regional security assistance. And I feel like this is particularly interesting to look at in the region that you have a whole bunch of countries that are facing internal security crises and turning toward a more militarized approach to managing violence within their own countries. And even within that, the hemisphere has been relatively stable, but then you see kind of points of contention, Mexico, Ecuador recently, and diplomatic relations with Venezuela, Guyana, just trying to do our policies. It's just kind of important to look at where the United States falls into facilitating or co-opting some of these policies. But yeah, as I mentioned, Colombian military is very competent, very capable, and the United States has been a partner for a very long time. For my research, I'm looking mostly at post-plan Colombia, but throughout the 1980s and 90s, the United States, between the global war on drugs, war on terror, Congress has a vested interest in making sure that all of our programs in Colombia uphold the highest human rights standards. It was a little bit of the Wild West back in the day. In 1994, there was a lot more congressional oversight in some of these operations. Brought us to Plan Colombia back in 2000. Although this has changed, Joe Biden, our president now, was an architect of Plan Colombia himself as a young senator. So he is a major vetted interest in addition to Congress kind of seeing this investment through. But yeah, so Plan Colombia kind of definitely mostly a militarized aid approach, which focuses a lot more on special forces, aviation, and intelligence. It's kind of the Marshall Plan of Colombia, in which military assistance took priority over development aid. But now, since we've reached peace, it's kind of split, that development is more so the priority. But in particular, the U.S. Army has a long history of military links with Colombian armed forces. The Rangers, with the Lancero training course, work with their special operations community. A lot of that was in counter-narcotics operations, counterinsurgency, and counterterrorism. But now, since we've entered the peace effort, the whole U.S. government interagency is at work to make the peace plan possible, with kind of USAID, INL, and other more civilian law enforcement agencies at the forefront of that. And then, of course, climate and human rights being the forefront of that partnership. Since President Petro was a member of FARC himself, there was kind of within Washington, there was a little bit of nerves about how this relationship would change, but our objectives still remain. But since then, the United States has been the #1 partner in seeing the peace deal through, and that remains to this day. They are by far the largest contributor to any type of assistance in seeing the peace deal. So it's been over $1 billion in direct aid since 2016. So although the windows of opportunity for collaboration have evolved, they have not ended, and the United States remains firm in our partnership. So to talk a little bit of some of the line of efforts within the Colombian government, we got the chance to meet with Ministry of Defense officials, talk with representatives from the United States Embassy, and that there is kind of a cultural shift of the armed forces to a more peacetime force. And a lot of this has taken more of a human security-centric approach, particularly within our visit at the Ministry of Defense. They spoke very strongly about how previous efforts of our security relationships, such as kill and capture, aerial eradication, etc., they don't feel that that's the most effective framework to collaborate upon. And then a lot of this effort takes the form of implementing the Comprehensive Rural Reform Chapter under the 2016 Peace Accord. They're called the PDETs in Spanish, but the Territorial Focused Development Program, which is about 36% of Colombia's territory. That's kind of the center of the strategy for the Comprehensive Development Plan. Over 170 municipalities who are most impacted by the conflict, that the state is the weakest, and there's the highest level of illicit activities, which my colleagues gone over a lot more. In addition, the Colombian Army has kind of adopted this Damascus Doctrine, which has been reviewed by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and incorporated the doctrinal body of the armed forces, which is definitely more human security focused, looking at how they've changed their unified land operations with respect to human rights and international law, and trying to professionalize a lot of these efforts and engagements with civilian populace. And this has been a regionalized approach within all 5 commands, which commanders put protection of the civilian population first. And a lot of this is some lessons learned and awareness of atrocities that have occurred in the 90s and earlier 2000s. So in addition to that, the Colombian military has been deemed, and Colombian general, as a NATO member, major ally, and with that comes a really strong responsibility of interoperability and professionalization that the US collaborates very strongly with the military on. And regardless of the geopolitical context, Petro is a very big personality internationally, but he's come to alignment with a lot of issues that the United States sees, whether that's Ukraine, climate change, and so on. So within the Colombian government, we did uncover in a lot of our meetings and candid conversations that there is sort of kind of a level of distrust between the service chief level, as in the Army, Navy, Marines, etc., that they don't necessarily feel empowered by the president. And this has been a lot to do with how their roles of engagement with all these aforementioned armed actors has changed on the operational level. But what we did come to find is that the respect for the Constitution is so strong within the Colombian military that going back to those civilian governance models of civil mil relations, there's no threat necessarily of coup or any democratic norm. But it is pretty tense, and a lot of this, when Petro came in, there were a lot of forced retirements, undercutting of the intelligence community for different reasons. But it's kind of offset their offensive capabilities within these ad hoc negotiations with all these different groups, according to different military sources. And it seems that like Petro's end state, in terms of the strategic level, it's kind of convoluted. And because of that, that has changed the way in which the military is engaging with the public. And unfortunately, this has led to kind of the highest level of cocoa cultivation in the history of Colombia. In our conversations with INL and other organizations, and because they're losing their offensive capabilities, emboldened these armed actors to not only, since it's a pause of operations against Colombian state, they've taken this opportunity to fight each other and consolidate their own territories. So they're taking this time to kind of regroup. And as mentioned, yeah, Plan the Golfo has about like 30% of Colombia, so it's pretty serious. So moving forward to kind of public perceptions of the state, as I mentioned, it's a very complex war legacy in the case of Colombia. We're talking a 50-year domestic insurgency and civil war. That means no community, no family has been impacted to this. And a lot of these military officers and people who have committed atrocities in Colombia, I'm not making any generalizations about the armed forces, but they do have some type of connection to America, whether that was in training or not. And, I mean, in the 90s and early 2000s, there were many extrajudicial killings and domestic intelligence operations that the USG kind of didn't look the other way, but there was definitely a level of impunity, whether that was because these cases were tried in military courts or etc. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of this changed in 1994 because Congress wanted to insulate itself kind of this dirty war. But it's not to be said that there aren't informal partnerships within the Colombian government, and the price has been thousands of dead, disappeared, terrorized. Most notably, the Falso Positivos scandal, in which the Colombian military murdered innocent civilians and dressed them up as guerrillas in order to increase their casualty rates for bonus pay. So a lot of the historic way in which the counterinsurgency is fought is a huge influence in how the Colombian public perceives the military. But I feel like the Colombian military has an understanding of this, and they're working to mediate these types of relations. On the contrary to that, because Colombian military has fought insurgency for about 50 years, they have their own views, the public, especially the communities that have been long held by FARC and different insurgent groups, that they're facilitators to the insurgents. So that also is another element in which the state interacts with each other. In addition, going back to the U.S. role in this, the Colombian military has collaborated a lot with aerial eradication and crop eradication to try to curb the level of cocoa in the country, and this has been a trademark U.S. program. And yeah, as I mentioned, this is a backbone of bilateral anti-drug partnership between Colombia and the United States. And this has led to forced displacement. It's displaced people's livelihoods, and it's kind of forced civilians to choose between living in a limited state presence between the military and these different armed groups. It's very, very, very complex. A lot of our conversations alluded that there's two Colombias, and that's something we have heard over and over and over, that it's entirely a highly unequal society. And because of that, if you don't address the means of inequality, it's going to change the way that people perceive the state and what services they should receive. Yeah, so I mean, we heard some really interesting stories about the reintegration of FARC fighters, which has proven to be a really huge challenge in the Colombian context. At the UN verification mission, we heard of now that a lot of these fighters have demobilized, there's stories of soldiers being protected by individuals who they fought in close combat with, but now, since they've de-armed, these are the people protecting them. And in addition, I mean, the humanitarian impact of this, we spoke with UN OSHA and just the different social containment policies that they've utilized during negotiations with the government. It's rather disturbing how they kind of just shut down society and they eliminate the ability of people to exit and enter these types of areas. So a woman needs to give birth, she can't leave. There's no church, there's no school, and it shuts everything down. In addition, you put in that there's regions of Colombia that have never had a state presence, particularly the Amazon, which is 42% of the country, and you have the indigenous guards, and they don't want to be a part of the Colombian state, and that makes territorial integration much more difficult. But the United States is invested in seeing the success of the peace plan, and a lot of this is because Congress is interested in it. There's a huge Colombian diaspora here in the U.S. The United States made a huge investment in the success of Colombia. So tying back to my original research question, who holds the monopoly of violence in Colombia? That's still to be determined. It depends who you ask, where you ask it, and who's around you. And the whole situation is entirely hyper-localized, as you've seen in some of the visualizations that my colleagues have presented. And it should be approached that way, because if everyone agreed, there wouldn't be a conflict. So looking ahead about the future of U.S. assistance in Colombia, I think the biggest place we find ourselves now is that after the military secures an area, civilian agencies within the Colombian government must be able to follow through to provide basic services like schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and economic development to achieve the rule of law. And I mean, decades of state absence in these areas have become one of the biggest challenges of Colombia. A lot of these groups now are fighting for territorial control when there was kind of a gentleman's agreement within a lot of these areas since the FARC is demobilized. And within that comes an opportunity for the United States government to assist, particularly on technical exchanges within our own interagency to improve their ability to deliver state services. And yes, supporting close interagency coordination, particularly among the Colombians' agricultural, education, transportation, health, and defense ministries. And unfortunately, I think that they need more, not less, military and police forces to be able to secure these areas to bring the state back in, so to say. But a lot of this comes from strengthening the intelligence community and the judiciary to be able to investigate and prosecute crimes like gold mining that I was able to talk a little bit about. But my other final conclusion from our trip is that the United States can only assist in these types of issues at the invitation of the Colombian government, right? So as these windows kind of fade and change, they have a large role to play. And when our interagency, whether that's USAID, Department of Defense, State, our Civil Affairs, Department of Justice, etc., when we can work together to help their interagency work together is when we have the biggest window of success. So I'll leave it with that, that leaders sign peace deals and people make peace. So Colombia is ready for peace, and it takes a whole government effort, and the United States has a role to play in that. So thank you.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes of Q&A, so please, someone, otherwise I'll ask the question. Chloe.
Oh, I have a question for Hunter, and it's kind of specific, but I'm just curious. So, you mentioned that illegal gold is really, really hard to trace. But since you said, I think like 80% of it is illicit, and it's really difficult to formalize. So when security forces see these types of transactions going on, assuming they're like not corrupt actors, right? Do they assume that the gold that they're seeing is illegal, but they just can't prove it, or do they not care? Like, what are some of the dynamics there?
Yeah, it's a excuse me, it's a mix. Thank you for the question. I think to really look at transactions down the line, like once gold has left its source, it's much harder to prove that it's illegal. Like when you see a dredge and illegal mining happening, like that is not legal. You can like disrupt that, right? When you have gold now no longer from its source and someone showing up with like paperwork that says like this is from like this is like within the quota of like what this community is allowed to produce, and here's my 35 grams of gold that I'm giving you. It requires intelligence to know whether or not that is truly legally produced and truly artisanally sourced gold, or if it's produced by illegal actors. I will say there's a lot of egregious examples of like where I guess two factors. One, due diligence is really hard in the gold industry because of the lack of traceability. At the same time, there are egregious examples of people who are willingly looking the other way or like really should know. And there's a couple things that, like, if you see all of a sudden very small communities who historically have not been producing a lot of gold all of a sudden the amount of gold that's coming out of this community, even if it's all coming from artisanal permits, is skyrocketing, that's a red flag. Or, often someone who is an artisanal miner does have this cap, but they likely don't have the resources to be able to invest in that activity to actually reach that cap. So if you see people consistently all the time, like filling this quota, and these communities are always like at the top of their quotas, I think that's like a red flag. But it does require intelligence, and so that is one of the issues, is that people are showing up to gold brokers, and the gold brokers are asking for paperwork, but then it's incumbent on them to say, like, is this actually legitimate paperwork or what's going on? And so that's the challenge.
This is a question for everybody. I know some of you touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to hear more about who specifically you all spoke to in Colombia with respect to your research and what you took away from them, like 2 people and 2 takeaways.
I think one of the most interesting meetings and ultimately meeting that but Fundación Ideas para la Paz is like an independent think tank in Colombia. I was actually started by business leaders during the FARC conflict, and does a lot of independent analysis of crime and conflict in Colombia, and they sent one of their analysts. And he gave a really interesting takeaway. I brought up the point that oftentimes the trepidation with approaching criminal groups in negotiations, that bringing them to the table is inherently legitimization. He kind of pushed back on that point and said that it's simply a recognition of their capacity as a conflict actor, which I thought was kind of a novel take, considering that that's usually the argument against negotiating with these groups. And yeah, everyone else I put on my little slide. But that was one of my more insightful meetings.
I can go. So I think the hands down the most helpful meeting that I had was in Medellin, and I spoke with folks, thanks to Scott, from the Alliance for Responsible Mining, which is a group based there in Medellin, but they actually also do work in Peru. They do some work in different countries in Africa. So it's a really cool group that works directly with artisanal and small scale miners to help them become formal miners and to help formalize their activities. Really, really interesting work. Also, just like they were great people to talk with, but like absolute experts on the topic. Like obviously it's like what they do every day. And it was a conversation where I was speaking with them for like 2 hours, and the last 20 minutes was me being like, sorry, just one more question. Actually, I'm so sorry, just one more question for you. They were so helpful and really talking to me about like the details of the legal framework around mining in Colombia, because you can read about it, but it is very complicated. And so for me, this was like my intro to the issue of legal mining. And so actually trying to like really understand what the framework is, where are the challenges, was so helpful for them, because Scott was with me too, and they drew out like a little diagram. We're like, okay, here's the different levels, here's the different requirements of each level, like here's where the issues are, here's where people are falling. So that was the best.
Good.
To add to that at the end of that meeting, I had decided, as Hunter pointed out, I think if you were sitting in the shoes of the average miner somewhere in Cordoba or the South, you would say, no, I will not be trying to formalize because of the sheer mountain of paperwork that you have to go through that, as Hunter pointed out, is constantly changing. I would say we were able to speak with the World Resources Institute, and this touches on one of Hunter's slides that talked about kind of the nexus between different illicit economies, coca growing and illegal gold mining. I think something that we do a lot as either academia members or practitioners in DC is try to divide and silo these different activities or these different criminal typologies. And just speaking to specifically one of the WRI members who talked about illegal mining, she spent about half the time talking about every crime that happens around illegal mining, and how the idea of kind of dividing and categorizing these different activities is just ludicrous when you're actually on the ground. So that was very helpful for me.
Yeah, last but not least, I'll keep it short. We got to hear from folks in the humanitarian community about challenges in coordinating assistance across that. So that panel was probably my favorite. And then for my research is probably most relevant. We had a US Embassy panel. So
Okay, Marta.
I have a question for Scott. I was wondering if there's like any relationship with El Clan del Golfo and other like international criminal organizations like the ones in Mexico, and how that is making it more difficult for the government of Colombia to kind of end with the criminal like network that is, I think it's expanding around like the Americas in general, not only.
I think you put it perfectly. It is a big headache for the Colombian government. I do think it invites a little more collaboration outside of the US. So probably the Gaitanistas' biggest partner, it used to be the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. Today, I would say it's probably Ndrangheta in Italy. And that has brought kind of the full force of Italian law enforcement to kind of assist in combating the transnational cocaine trade. Italy is a unique country in that if you look at their kind of criminality based in different sources, it's very high, but so is their resilience to criminality, higher than any country in Europe. So getting kind of expertise from Italy can be very helpful. But as you said, unfortunately, the Gaitanistas have connections through what they call their kind of ambassadorial program, where they will send members, usually from within kind of the familial connections of the Usuga brothers, to specific countries in Central America, to Mexico, all across Europe. They have a couple representatives in the United States to basically ensure that the flows of cocaine remain smooth. And that gets to kind of what I was talking about with the preference that international organizations have for the Gaitanistas. That's why they can maintain higher coca prices for their growers, why they can keep that business model working, because ultimately when you source your cocaine from the Gaitanistas, you have a much higher chance of receiving your product than you would from the ELN or a smaller organization that can't guarantee total territorial control.
There's a lot of questions here. Let me go back here first, then we'll go to the other side of the room.
This question can be for anyone, but I'm curious if you had any ideas about your research topics before visiting Colombia that you changed after these meetings and after the experiences.
I can start. I didn't know if there was a
I can say something. This was maybe me being naive, but I really thought that the illegal gold mining question was going to be very niche. And almost every person we talked to mentioned it in some way, shape, or form. And so I was really surprised. I mean, I think and then once you really dig into the issue, and like Scott was saying, the connections to pretty much every other illicit economy, every other crime that's going on in Colombia, like has an nexus to gold. But I think that surprised me was just like basically everyone we talked to had something to say about it.
I wouldn't say my topic changed that much, but I'm not going to cop out, take a similar answer to Hunter. I thought it was interesting how every single group we met with, whether they were in like the energy sector or conflict resolution, they always talked about how inextricably linked conflict was to things like development and things like business. So it was really cool to have meetings with organizations about mining and energy infrastructure and have total peace come up. But my topic stayed the same.
Yeah, I would say a similar cop out. My question didn't necessarily change, but looking at kind of the different parties who spoke either in favor of previous strategies, not just against the Gaitanistas, but in general against non-state armed groups in the country, and what came up continuously with often without even needing to be prompted was what Hunter mentioned, which was a moving away from a kingpin, go after the kind of larger figures strategy, and more of a follow the money, cut them off, whether that's cutting off money laundering through illegal mining, whether that's money laundering through kind of more niche industries like tourism or the music industry, which is pulling in massive amounts of Gaitanista money. I think the fact that there wasn't actually this symphony of different disagreeing voices. It was a pretty concerted answer of follow the money.
Okay, go Sylvia, then Henry.
My question is mostly for Michael, but Scott might have input on it. See, during your presentation, you were talking about how negotiating with non-ideological groups is relatively new to conflict management. And Paz Total is an effort to negotiate with over a dozen plus groups. Are there any other non-ideological armed groups that the Petro government is currently trying to negotiate with, and could that set a precedent for negotiations with the Gulf Clan? And then the second question is, you said that they also had noted willingness to enter negotiations with the government. Why did they do that? Is there a mutually enticing opportunity right now? Like, why would they reach out to the government?
Other criminal groups, I think /Gulf Clan is really the main one. Like I said, there's a distinction in Colombian law, criminal groups versus political groups. And the Cardenistas are the only criminal group at a national level that's been defined as engageable in negotiations. But they have been doing, Scott actually, I think, but some kind of local level negotiations with gangs in Medellin and other organizations, but not quite to the national level scale that they are with the Cardenistas. And in terms of the willingness to negotiate, it was really because the organization was heading into a weak position. Time Octarian was willing to negotiate for essentially a lighter sentence for
That was recently.
that was in 2017, so right after the FARC peace accord had happened, but pre his arrest in 2021. Is when he had offered to negotiate. He ended up being arrested and actually without a comprehensive negotiation.
So then why would they reach out during the trial?
They want to be like now.
Yeah.
They want to be legitimized as a political group. And whether that's because they have a real ideology or not is questionable, but kind of Scott made the point that when the Colombian government is engaging in ceasefires with all these groups that compete with the Gulf Clan, but is not in a ceasefire with them, it disadvantages them vis-a-vis their competitors. So it's kind of a double-edged, they get a legitimacy kick out of this, and it's their benefit to have a ceasefire with the government. That's kind of how I view it currently. I don't know if you have a
No, I think that solidifies it, that there are other smaller non-ideological groups that there are ongoing negotiations with, Las Paisas, Los Rastrojos, and Los Caparos, but as Michael said, these aren't viewed as national security threats, so their ability to act as spoilers is much more minimal, where it's, a group like the Cardenistas that has 30% of the territory, probably more at this point, can really be the kind of defining factor behind success or failure. Hostile talk.
Henry.
Question for Scott. Have the Cardenistas expressed any interest in sort of an autonomous relationship with the government in Bogota for their region, or any sort of secessionist leadings? And if not, why do you think they haven't?
So they have not. This gets kind of to not only ideology, and we can go back and forth as you've seen all day on kind of how ideological this group is, but I think it gets back to the kind of typology of what they are. Their roots are in paramilitarism, which ultimately requires a degree of cooperation and collusion with the state, same as what you would have with larger narcotics trafficking organizations elsewhere in the region. The ideal situation is not secession or disrupting the state. It's working collaboratively with them so that you can ensure faster, more consistent shipment of whatever product you're moving. So in case of the Cardenistas, no, they're not looking to overthrow, they're looking to co-opt.
Sure.
And I saw you raise your hand before.
I figured a difficult question was in order. No, Paul Miller, full disclosure, Paul Miller, SAIS alum, adjunct prof. Great presentations. I was in Cordoba in Monteria, and I saw on the wall a statement by the municipality, gobernar es corregir. I think what means to govern is to correct, which was very frightening to us when we saw it at the time. This was several years ago. My question, though, relates to the Clan del Golfo and its resilience, the way in which the war was prosecuted. And by the way, you guys really shook up things. Not only was there a new offer to negotiate, but the former President Uribe is will now stand trial for witness tampering in a trial that has to do with his relationship with paramilitaries. Whatever you did, it was powerful. But my question is the way the war was prosecuted, including the collaboration with the paramilitaries, the way in which private companies and others participated in some way with the land grabs and the taking over of economic assets. Is that has something to do with why the Clan del Golfo is so resilient, number one, and number two, that the state is unable or unwilling to exercise control in these territories? Did that come up over?
So when you refer to the narco land grabs, I think you're talking a little bit pre-2006. This is more kind of AUC moving. This is where the Castaños are trying to basically extend territory just within Urabá. And I do want to caveat, while I think it was important to go through the history of the organization, at each stage with each new leader, they immediately make rapid adaptations. So the Gaitanistas underneath the current leader, Chiquito Malo, are not at all what they were under Otaniel. They basically will do a constant kind of tug of war between how vertical and how horizontal they are. I think that honestly gets back more to the resilience in that under new leadership, they will adapt the organization, not necessarily the individuals themselves, to kind of survive whatever it is the state is throwing at them. So in the case of, an extended war led by Uribe, you will have an organization that's very horizontal, purely franchising, and you're giving minimal mandates and kind of directives to your lower level organizations. And an individual bloque has incredible autonomy, much more like, the Andrangheta, where, you really don't speak to the principals in this case, Cordoba or Chocó very much. Right now, because the organization is basically the only one facing threats, you have something that's much more vertical. When Chiquito Malo took over, he immediately went through and not quite purged leadership, but let's say like spring cleaning of just, putting anyone who wasn't immediately following in line or seen as effective. So I think that adaptation on really a personal level rather than an institutionalized form of governance or criminal opportunity is helping them survive from 2006 all the way to now. That covers the question.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're gonna take a 10-minute break, and then we're gonna go into the second panel, which is human rights and politics. Okay, so thank you again for joining us. Now we're gonna move into our second panel, which is gonna be focused on human rights and politics. So we have 4 amazing panelists that are gonna cover their subject. We're gonna start off with Marta, followed by Allison, then we'll go on to JD, and finally we'll end the panel with Finn. So without further ado, please, Marta.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be. I'm very happy to be opening the panel today on human rights and politics. My presentation and my research is humanitarian intelligence in supporting transit migrants in the Gulf of Urabá. I decided to research because do this for research because I'm a humanitarian by heart, but also because we're in a moment in history where we are seeing a high escalation of displacement populations, and I think the demand on humanitarian aid is increasing, and the humanitarian demand is in unprecedented historic high. So we have to understand the challenges that humanitarians go through in order to get this aid delivered effectively to, especially the migrants in this case. So where is the Gulf of, next please. where is the Gulf of Urabá and what is the Darien Gap? The Gulf of Urabá, as you can see in the map, is in the north of Colombia, and you can find Necoclí, where migrants take legal and illegal boats to the ports in Acandí and in Campurganá, where they initiate their journey into the Darien. The Darien jungle is more than 575,000 hectares, which is like around 5,750 square kilometers. It's both a natural and it's one of the most dangerous jungles to access. It's both a natural barrier, but and a bridge between Central and South America, and it has been a migratory. Historically, it has been a migratory path for all this time. For example, in 2010, there was like a very high peak on Haitians crossing because of the earthquake in their country. But it didn't make it into like international news and until like the government of Colombia, Panama, and especially the United States started to see a high peak of migrants crossing with their final destination being the United States. Next, please. So there are three main migratory ways of crossing the Darien Gap. I will be focusing on the first one, which is via the Atlantic. Is the cheapest and most dangerous way of crossing. Then via the Pacific, which is the one that the most like migrants with the most resources use. And then the third one is via an overland route in Rio Sucio, Choco, but this one is currently inactive. Here, next please. We here are 4 stats and numbers to show you how critical the situation is. So as you can see in the graph in the middle, in 2023, there were like around 500,000 migrants crossing the Darien jungle. This is like around 46 times higher than it was in 2019, which is very high, and it's almost double 2022, the number in 2022. 1 in 5 migrants are children. Most of them are coming from Venezuela. 64% are coming from Venezuela. Then 12% are coming from Ecuador. 9% from Haiti. But then we are receiving, like the Darien is also receiving more people from China recently, Bangladesh, Iran, Afghanistan, Cameroon, and other places that are not South America per se. 97% of the migrants that were interviewed by the International Crisis Group said that the Darien is and was one of the most dangerous parts of their journey. At the end of the day, I chose, thank you. At the end of the day, I chose this research because I wanted to give a voice to the migrants. And I wanted to focus on humanitarian aid because it was not being filled. There was a vacuum. And I wanted to talk about the humans behind the numbers that I offered to you before. But due to timing, I'm gonna just quote Eliana Alfaro, who was interviewed by Doctors Without Borders. And she said, quote, "The Darien Gap is the worst thing in the world. We saw dead people, children, desperate mothers. We felt like the jungle was going to consume us. It is hell," end quote. So let's not forget that migrants are the actual like topic of this research. Next, please. In our trip to Colombia, the 4 main challenges that were mentioned by both humanitarian organizations and the UN were funding, security, politics, and coordination. And I will go for these challenges briefly. Next, please. So starting with funding, because as I said before, funding was one of the most mentioned in this in the trip that we made, and it's one of the most pressing challenges. So as we can see in the graph to the left, to my left, funding has been decreasing in the last couple of years. 55 in 2019, 55% of the requirements were met, but then we see the decrease. 2020, 47% of the requirements were met, 41% in 2021, 35% in 2022, and as we can see in the box, total requirements were around $1.8 billion, and then $1.2 billion were unmet. And then it has kept decreasing. 2023, 22% were met. There is also something in the humanitarian sphere that is called donor fatigue, and that humanitarians have to deal with. So basically, government donors want to see how to stop migrants from crossing these dangerous paths, but they want to see an immediate a solution, no? And this is not happening. That's not the nature of humanitarianism. So they aren't happy with how the containment of this issue is going. So that's one of the reasons why funding is decreasing too. And then something that also was mentioned in this trip was the nature of humanitarian funding. So it's basically how and when it is allotted. Most humanitarian financing tends to be short-term, like 1 year at most. So the challenge comes in, like how are you able to plan a long-term planning when you don't know if you're going to receive a grant in 6 months from now. So it becomes a challenge to create meaningful long-term strategies when financing is short-term in nature. Next, please. So as we can see here, this is basically like how the problem and the transit is increasing, but then the funding is decreasing. So I just wanted to show you these two graphs next to each other for more clearance. Next, please. I will briefly go into security because as my this is Gulf Clan basically, and as my colleague Scott explained, the Urabá region is where the Gulf Clan roots lie and where they establish their strongest presence. They have a complete governance of this region, so there is lack of state governance. Not only does the group exert a violent presence, but it also practices criminal governance by replacing the rule of law, co-opting community spaces and organizations, imposing norms of conduct and restrictions, and imposing norms of conduct and restrictions. As migrants who arrived in Necoclí, Capurganá, and Acandí have to deal with these groups, they all, like humanitarian organizations that are in the ground, have also to deal with these groups. But also something that was interesting to learn in the trip is that actually this criminal group protects the migrants because they want to they are profiting for this business with the migrants, and they want them to safely cross or at least cross to the Darien. So in these regards, humanitarian organizations are welcome to be in the Urabá region, but they will also be monitored by these groups. So their meetings will be monitored. Their information that they are going to be sharing with migrants and locals will also be monitored. So this kind of creates like a constraint in the movement of freedom of these humanitarian organizations because they will always be having the Gulf Clan kind of like behind their back. By talking with humanitarian, something important that I want to highlight is that by talking with humanitarian organizations and security officials in the trip, I got to the conclusion that this is actually a perception of lack of security that these humanitarian organizations have to not operate in the ground. There are protection systems, but they're not coming from the state. They're coming from these criminal. Next, please. A third challenge that we also that was also very mentioned in our trip is national and international politics. Basically, bureaucratic impediments to humanitarian access by donor countries and institutions greatly complicate the ability of people in need to reach basic assistance, and impair also the ability of humanitarian organizations to deliver this assistance. For example, in delaying the visas for these humanitarian actors to go to the country, or delaying delivery of this in-kind assistance. Also, as we all know here in Washington, D.C., politics is an important factor in humanitarian assistance, taking into account especially the funding. Most of the funding, around 70% of the funding comes from the US. So this funding will be, this funding will be depending on who is in office and their perception on humanitarianism and their skepticism of humanitarianism. Then, for example, Panama lately has been accusing international bodies of directing migrants into Panama by providing them with information on how to safely cross the Darien. And then Colombia also has accused humanitarian organizations of fooling this criminal organization, of fooling the activities and the criminal business of the El Golfo clan, El Clan del Golfo, sorry. Something that was mentioned also in the trip is that Colombia is very much political, so it's special in its own way because it's very political, so it creates a lot of challenges for humanitarians. And lastly, I will go into, next please. into coordination. In humanitarian aid, coordination is defined as bringing together various actors to ensure a coherent response to emergencies by ensuring that humanitarian efforts are carried out jointly and efficiently, avoiding duplication. One of the most important mechanisms in Colombia right now is the Interagency Group for Mixed Migration Flows, the GIFMM, which is led by the IOM and UNHCR, which is doing a great job. Don't get me wrong, but it has two main issues that they're not working on. So much it's one, avoiding the duplication of programs, which is a problem, and then two, inclusion. And with inclusion, I mean, local NGOs are invited to participate in the work space, in their communication spaces, but they are not granted membership, so they cannot actually benefit from all that this interagency has to offer, especially funding. There is a need for more inclusive coordination mechanisms to ensure a representative and effective humanitarian response in the region. Something that we learned in this trip is the coordination mechanisms in Colombia are still very ineffective. Most of the humanitarian portfolios overlap, they are mixed, and they change because they are in continuous change because of the funding, as I explained before. Programs at the end of the day in humanitarian organizations are influenced by the high rotation as well of civil servants and civil society organizations. So that kind of also creates problems at the end of coordinating programs in the ground. And this is the end of my presentation. Next, please. Thank you so much. Last point that I would like to last point that I would like to mention is that I invite you all to read the New York Times article that was just published that talks about sexual abuses on the Darien. And I just invited you. It's a great kind of summary of what I have to you today. Yeah.
So thank you guys so much for listening to our presentations. And my research for this capstone has been on human rights and UN interventions in Colombia since the 2016 agreement. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Thank you. So my interest in this came this summer when the UN Human Rights Council released a resolution in July on technical assistance and capacity building in human rights. And so all of this text is to say that they were calling for the full implementation of the peace agreement as a means to protect human rights. And they appointed a human rights expert to go to Colombia and identify obstacles of implementation of the peace agreement, and then the subsequent consequences that this has had for full enjoyment of human rights. So essentially, the UN is noticing that the human rights situation in Colombia is in need of assistance. Okay, so given this resolution, I wondered how have state institutions and peace accords failed to uphold human rights and protection since the 2016 FARC peace agreement, and then what role did the UN play in attempting to remedy this, or what role does the UN play? So I started by looking at existing literature on human rights in Colombia, and there's not a lot. But what there is very ethnographic and regional, which makes sense given the nature of Colombia as like a highly disparate country with a lot of variance from region to region. And I also found that human rights defenders are a big focal point in literature, which is interesting because the treatment of human rights defenders can often act as a signal for the acceptance of human rights within a society. And so unfortunately, all of this literature is about the persecution and murder of human rights defenders in Colombia, which has increased pretty significantly since 2016. So outside of academic resources, I also wanted to include current human rights reports from different institutions like the UN, different NGO reports, government reports, because I think it's important to give insight into like the on-the-ground dynamics of the situation, because this is something that is rapidly and constantly changing. So with this, I saw a gap in the analysis of the relationship between human rights in Colombia and the implementation of the peace agreement, and then how the UN is involved with this. So that's what I've been hoping to work on this semester. Next. Okay, so when looking at human rights in Colombia, I wanted to pick some populations to help gauge the situation. And I was looking for vulnerable populations that experience some of the most pervasive and persistent violations. So I decided to focus on women and children. They're the UN population focus in Colombia on human rights, as well as migrants, given the persistence of the Venezuelan migration crisis in Colombia. And then rural, indigenous, and Afro-Colombian populations are often grouped together and experience very similar violations and tend to be some of the most discriminated in Colombian society. There's a lot of overlap between these populations and the violations that they experience, but I think it's important to separate them out to see what violations have been occurring based on those specific identities. Next, please. So in going to Colombia, my primary goal in meeting with organizations was to just gauge the situation from different perspectives, from whoever we could meet with, what they thought the situation of human rights was, the challenges they saw, if they saw a relationship with the peace agreement, just any thoughts really. And then I also wanted to get some insight onto the function of the UN within Colombia, what it is able to do and what its goals and opinions are within Colombia. And then how relevant this resolution that I'm using to frame my research is to current operations on the ground. So next slide, please. In Colombia, we got to go to some really amazing, incredible meetings. And I found some really insightful information from our UN panel, which has been mentioned before, but just UNHCR, UN OCHA, and the World Food Program gave a really comprehensive insight onto the footprint in Colombia, as well as interagency coordination within the UN, as well as with other NGOs that are working in the area. And then the verification mission and the head of mission provided a lot of explanation about the apolitical role of the mission as an assistant in the implementation of the peace agreement rather than functioning through the typical UN agencies. We also learned a lot about violence and the system of non-state armed groups, particularly through Insight Crime. That was very helpful for me. And then the humanitarian panels and US aid had incredible knowledge of the areas of most need, which was really useful for me in determining like what specific human rights violations are occurring. As well as the US Embassy just giving us a wider insight and foreign perspective on the situation in Colombia and the peace agreement. So from these meetings, I developed this theory that there's a twofold understanding of human rights in Colombia. And so the first concern is with violations, and those are going to be, oh wait, sorry, it's on the last slide. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, so those are going to be like the immediate threats that are related to violence. And so the response to those threats is more so concerned with humanitarian aid and disaster relief. And then once those threats are sort of mitigated and there's more human security, you can start to develop a system of protection. That's going to be guaranteed by the state, upheld by the state, and is part of the ultimate goal of peace. Next slide. So a lot of the insights that I gained in Colombia were on the factors of the decreasing situation of human rights. And the primary thing that I learned was the persistence of violence as the main barrier to implementing a better system of human rights preservation. Because not only is like the persistence of violence committing violations in itself, but it's also preventing a new system of human rights from being developed. Additionally, the post-2016 state of affairs with the non-state armed groups in Colombia is a lot more chaotic without the FARC. And so because it's more chaotic and with the Paz Total negotiations, it's just a lot more difficult for groups to come to the table and reach agreements. And so that allows violence to continue and groups find new alleyways where they can continue to perpetuate violence.
And then the politicization of the peace agreement had emerged as like a really big factor in slowing the implementation of the agreement itself. It's caused institutional paralysis, inconsistent application, and just a general lack of consistency within the state. So the role of external actors was another really big takeaway that I had, especially from the UN Verification Mission and humanitarian aid organizations that are working in Colombia on humanitarian principles or human rights principles that are apolitical. And so they're not going to be aligned with any goals of the state or foreign organizations, and they're always going to remain the same. And so that can be a really difficult position to navigate in a constantly polarized and changing political environment. And then finally, all of this was really related to the interconnected nature of complex crises in Colombia. I found that every meeting there was some sort of human rights violation that was mentioned, whether it was the armed groups using indigenous gold quotas and like sort of taking advantage of indigenous communities in that way, to coca production, to even like carbon markets. And a lot of this is targeted at indigenous communities. Next slide. So after Colombia, I wanted to look a little bit further at the UN's human rights priorities. So I used the interventions of the UNHRC within the past year or so as sort of a gauge to see what signals they are sending about their main concerns in the area. So there's, of course, the first resolution that I was looking at about the peace agreement. But then in September, they had a visit and a report that warned about insufficient implementation of non-recurrence guarantees. So this is related to the peace agreement and the idea that they're not implementing these guarantees that this conflict won't happen again, and how that is actually fueling increasing violence in the country. In early March, there was a visit that signaled the importance of indigenous protections as a part of paz total negotiations. And then just a few weeks ago, Antonia Orejola, who is the human rights expert appointed by the UN in July, released her report, and her primary concern and her primary finding was that the politicization of the peace agreement within Colombian society has prevented its implementation. So her solution and her proposal is to integrate the peace agreement into state policy so that it becomes less politicized and more consistent. So that's sort of where the UN is at right now. Next slide, please. So given all of this research, I was able to determine that violence is the primary issue facing all of my areas of focus, but they each do have specific challenges that are unique to their identity. So for example, women are facing a lot of gender-based violence, and just like Marta was mentioning, especially in the Darien, that's a big problem. Children are being targeted by armed groups to try to protect them from military operations targeting the groups, because they won't act on a group if there's children involved. So they're actively recruiting children. Rural populations face really high difficulties in accessing state systems, but especially judicial systems. And then indigenous and Afro-Colombian populations are seeing a lot of entrepreneurs or other armed criminal actors coming in and taking advantage of the rights that they are guaranteed within the Constitution. So my preliminary conclusions are sort of threefold to try to start to answer my research question. So I found that the primary concern for human rights in Colombia right now is the persistence of violence by non-state armed groups. And with that, the peace agreement has failed to protect human rights because a lot of the provisions that were meant and created to protect human rights have not yet been implemented. So there's no protections in place to protect people. And then finally, the UN involvement, it's functioning as an apolitical entity to try to
promote human rights and the implementation of the peace process, but they've been very clear that these two things are inherently linked in their eyes. So yeah, and then finally, I have some further research that I'm hoping to do before I can fully answer my research question on just the more specifics of the Colombian law and the peace agreement itself, as well as President Petro's human rights approach that he's been emphasizing throughout his administration, and how effective that's actually been, if it's been implemented, and how substantive it is. And yeah, I have some future potential projects, but I will turn it over to JD. Thank you. Yeah. That's the best pictures in the gym.
Just about.
Laughing.
Yeah, it was good. It was good.
Well, thank you, Ali. Hello, everyone. My name is JD Mancini, and my research question is what are the causes of political polarization in Colombia, with a specific focus on how do Venezuelan migration and the FARC peace accord affect polarization. Bo had asked earlier in my research, or for the previous panel, how our research had changed or how our topic had changed. Initially, it was broader for causes of political polarization. I narrowed it down to Venezuelan migration, the FARC peace accord, but now I've rebroadened it based off of my time in research in Colombia back to the initial causes of political polarization. My research question will still remain the same, but I've found that beyond these two factors, there are more elements that contribute to political polarization in Colombia. Next slide, please. So the FARC peace accords have been a very polarizing element in Colombia. I've had numerous sources there confirm this with me. And initially it started when Juan Manuel Santos, who was a protege to former President Alvaro Uribe, who had been a proponent of a strong policy of military offensive towards fighting the FARC, had switched initially from continuing President Uribe's policies to pivoting towards peace. And once this happened, two heads of polarization emerged, sort of from the center right and to the right, between Santos and Uribe. It was almost seen by Uribe as a steep betrayal to him. So the pro-peace side of polarization, looking at promoting economic and social development, whereas anti-peace did not feel that working or negotiating with the party made sense. And many felt that the idea of restorative justice, transitional justice, was impunity towards the party as well. And so as a result, President Uribe, former President Uribe, held this no prisoners hold campaign against Santos in the peace process from 2014 to 2018. And it culminated, the polarization really truly culminated when the 2016 plebiscite, that was the referendum on the FARC peace accord, failed by a very narrow margin, 50.2% to 49.8%. Eventually, President Santos got it passed through Congress and implemented, but however, it was still a detrimental and polarizing period that continues to this day. This was also evident in the 2018 election with Iván Duque, another protege of former President Uribe. People voted for Duque because they opposed the terms of the peace accord and they wanted it to slow down, whereas current President Petro ran in 2018 as well. People voted for him because they supported the full implementation of the agreement. Next slide, please. So, Venezuelan migration. As many of you probably know, the Colombian state has been quite generous towards Venezuelan migrants, providing 10-year temporary protected statuses to millions of Venezuelan migrants. But large majorities of the population in Colombia have disapproved of the state's handling of migration, upwards of, at different times, 85% disapproving of how the state has handled it, according to an Inbound poll, which is a Colombian polling company. But oftentimes it's not so much just about the immigrants themselves as much as it's truly about the perception of the migrants. And it's the perception of how Colombian lives are affected by migration and how they perceive migration as a result. Many Colombians, local political press told me that many Colombians aren't really going to study much about migration, but they see Venezuelans are in industries and they watch the news that portrays them negatively. Clever politicians such as President Uribe, President Duque sort of capitalized on this narrative to promote this idea that, well, these Venezuelan migrants are going to bring Chavista Maduro politics here to Colombia, even if they were fleeing those kinds of politics in that regime. And they attached those migrants to left-wing political ideologies and parties. So the notion becomes, well, if you vote for the left, we are inevitably going to become a second Venezuela because all these Venezuelan migrants will also support these leftist politics as well. And so as a result, we need to vote for the right. Uribe and Duque promoted this idea of Castro Chavismo, and this was very prevalent in 2018. It's still very prevalent. It's receded in terms of the degree and the acuteness of how much it's polarizing the country, but it still polarizes and could return again in 2026 with the crisis at the Darien Gap, and also depending on how the US and Venezuela elections go in 2026. Political risk analysts confirmed this with me, and if depending on the results of that, it could be seen that Petro has failed on migration. Next slide, please. One of the things that I think was always constantly raised up that Reed mentioned earlier was this idea of two Colombias, even four Colombias. The idea that in places like Bogota and Medellin, you can have water quality like the Netherlands. But in places like La Guaira, which is in the north, very poor, very rural, the water quality is that of Zimbabwe. You have these starkly different visions of reality based on an urban-rural divide, and also based on racial minorities as well, who suffer disproportionately from the inequality. Colombia has a 51.5 Gini index, which is quite high. 36.6% of the population lives in poverty. And this, as I mentioned earlier, it disproportionately affects indigenous Afro-Colombians, as well as other groups such as women and LGBTQ individuals. It's believed from some of my sources that the pandemic may have exacerbated these inequalities, and which they manifested in this photo here in the 2021 protests around economic issues and police brutality. One of the interesting things a law professor mentioned to me while in Colombia was that the absence of populism in Colombia historically has delayed major social and economic reforms. And it could be that this enduring inequality is pushing a populism and a polarization towards that end. And that another source believed that these deeper rooted inequalities are actually channeled into polarization about the accord and migration themselves. This is something I'll have to explore more deeply, but it's definitely a very interesting angle. One law professor I spoke with as well discussed this idea that it's a global phenomenon, but global economic insecurity, which is quite prevalent in Colombia. She had come to believe that Petro has really mismanaged the economy so much to the point that people will grow to be so frustrated that they'll end up having some sort of an inclination to revolution almost. And one of the things that Sergio Guzman, a political risk analyst, talked to us about is that if the conservatives in Colombia, the center right, regain power, if they just treat it like this is the good old days, the good old boys will be back in power, they'll fundamentally misunderstand why Petro came to power in the first place. The idea of how a lack of representation for Afro-Colombians and indigenous Colombians and other minorities, LGBTQ women, will have been fundamentally unheard if that reality comes again. So if these sort of economic and social inequalities have continued to have an enduring impact. Another professor cast doubt on the notion of revolution in the sense that the internet has really helped raise livelihoods in Colombia, but the impact of economic inequality and global economic insecurity is something I'm going to continue to explore in my research. It's a global phenomenon, but Colombia is not spared from it. Next slide, please. And the last angle I really wanted to mention was the political rhetoric and use of social media. So regarding social media, much of polarization occurs through Twitter and WhatsApp chains. Many Colombians don't have access to the internet, so a lot of news gets filtered onto WhatsApp, which is a prime place for misinformation. Politicians use false narratives to support themselves and then use key social media figures to reproduce both these ideas and false narratives or to confirm biased views. We've even seen politicians who were formerly social media influencers become politicians and are really interested more in the communication side of politics rather than the actual legislating and governing. So politics professor I spoke with there said it hadn't necessarily led to extremism of polarization for sure. And there exists a strong link between social media as well as to the radio news that many people gain or watch. And that it's exacerbated the bias of mainstream news as well. One professor I spoke with, again, cast doubt on this notion of social media because it can be sort of exaggerated. When Petro has called people to the streets, not many people show up, but it still has a significant impact. And moving into how politicians use this rhetoric, moving back into how politicians use social media and how they polarize the country, one of the common things we learned about Gustavo Petro was that he doesn't realize he's still not a candidate. He's always on Twitter, which gives the impression that he's not really governing and he's promoting a polarizing rhetoric. When he doesn't get what he wants from the courts or Congress, he talks about having a constitutional assembly. Again, very polarizing, as well as Israel-Palestine issues. He's very pro-Palestine, but Colombia gets a lot of defense technology from Israel. And also this notion that anyone who is against him is an elite fundamentally against progress. Uribe, former President Uribe, on the top left, he has been a polarizing figure, not as president of Colombia, but as an opposition figure, particularly as we saw with the peace accords and with Venezuelan migration. Juan Manuel Santos himself has not been truly polarizing as a figure, but again, the peace accord, coming back to that, has been a polarizing issue. And lastly, looking at someone like Ivan Duque, he was not very active on social media. However, his acts as president and candidate contributed to polarization, talking about the opposition, closing the border, opposing Venezuela. And so all of these factors, whether it be the FARC peace process, political rhetoric and social media, economic and social inequality, and Venezuelan migration are contributing to political polarization to different varying degrees. Thank you so much, and I will transition to Finn.
It's always that.
It's a picture.
Hi, everyone. My name is Finney Brecher. Thank you for joining us today. So this presentation is entitled Colombia, a Comparative Study of the Party System. And my research has been centered around the Colombian political party system and the changes it has undergone in the past 30 years using a comparative lens. Next slide. So first, I wanted to quickly lay out how this presentation will proceed. I want to begin with my research question, which has guided all the work I've done over the past few weeks. Then I will go over my approach and what I learned through my literature review. Then I'll review the analysis I've conducted and finally present some preliminary conclusions. Next slide. So my research question is, what pressures proved insurmountable for the dominance of the Colombian conservative and liberal parties in the 2000s? And why has the Colombian party system undergone such dramatic change over the past 30 years? So I'm going to break this down in just a second. Next slide. So essentially, my research question is focused on examining why and how the Colombian party system, specifically their traditional two-party system, somewhat similar to what we have in the US, has changed in recent decades. Early on, I decided that I wanted to approach this task with a comparative lens, specifically by comparing the case of Colombia with that of Honduras over roughly the same period of time. So this shaped my literature review to a significant degree. I began by investigating literature on party system strength or institutionalization, as conceptualized by Professor Scott Mainwaring. A number of scholars have looked into how to measure institutionalization, robustness, or strength, all words that mean the same thing, really. This is a pretty well-developed field. There's also a lot out there on factors such as the historical legacy of parties, party branding, brand dilution, all of which have informed my analysis. In more specific terms, scholars have been divided on the case of Colombia, with some viewing the party system as still being strong as of the mid-2010s, while others believe it has weakened significantly. Honduras offers another example of shifting party strength, but one that has followed a very different trajectory with different political results, as I'll show later. Ultimately, I opted to examine the changes in Colombia's party system using 4 factors that Sanchez identified as underpinning party institutionalization. So they're listed up there, but they're also electoral volatility, citizen party linkages, party and electoral legitimacy, and the importance of party leaders. Next slide. So to begin, I'd like to unpack electoral volatility in Colombia. For over 100 years, civilian leadership in Colombia was held solely by members of the liberal or conservative parties, solely, only interrupted by periods of military rule. This goes back to the 1800s. We even have instances of formalized agreements between the parties to alternate control of the presidency and the legislature to control social tensions. So this is highly formalized, highly institutionalized. Beginning in the 1990s, however, this two-party system begins to lose its electoral dominance. And by the 2002 elections, neither of the traditional two parties can command a majority in the House of Representatives. And for the first time, the presidency is held by a member of a third party, Alvaro Uribe, who we've talked about a lot today. So on the left, you can see the 1994 Colombian House of Representatives results by the percentage of seats each party holds. And on the right, you can see 2022. There's a big shift there. So Congress has become ever more fractured, and every president since 2002 has come from a different political party. That's not typical. While constitutional reform has been blamed for this volatility, having made the formation of sort of smaller parties easier legally, the combination of conversations I had in Colombia, as well as the magnitude of the change, has made it clear to me that this reform was not the prime factor behind the electoral volatility, which has clearly eroded the two-party system, as neither party can command a majority reliably anymore, as they could for over 100 years. Next slide. So I wanted to quickly compare the Colombian and Honduran cases visually here. We can see much the same erosion of a two-party system, just as in Colombia, but in a very different form. So on the left, these are not exactly the same years, their electoral cycles don't line up. But in 1993, Honduras had a congressional election, and in 2021, they had one. You can see that the two main liberal and national parties, as they're called in Honduras, still persist, but they command very different levels of strength nowadays. And we see the emergence of two third parties, really, one of which has become almost dominant. So this demonstrates some of the insights we can gain from a comparative approach, two similar patterns, but with important differences that demonstrate a lot of the sort of nuance that's important in these cases. Next slide. So next, I want to underscore the importance and depth of citizen party linkages in Colombia and its impact on the party system. As an example, in 1948, popular liberal politician, former mayor of Bogota, and presidential candidate Jorge Gaitan was assassinated. We've talked about Gaitan a lot because this is what the Gulf Plan is named after. So a riot resulted in the Colombian capital of Bogota, known as the Bogotazo. The aftermath is shown here, and it destroyed large parts of the capital. Hundreds were killed, and a 10-year-long civil war broke out across the country, which killed hundreds of thousands of people. Why did this event lead, in part, to a civil war? Because of the importance of patronage. Individuals throughout the country, most importantly, large numbers of peasants, campesinos, identified with political parties extremely strongly, and in return for their support, extracted economic, political, and social benefits. This is not necessarily typical of many, democracies where you have patron-client systems. It's usually not so entrenched even in rural areas necessarily. And these sorts of linkages persist to this day to a lesser degree, especially in certain rural areas. We also see a similar relationship in Honduras, where elites are closely tied to certain political parties, but not instances of sort of this widespread violence or countrywide unrest to the same degree. So this is a really crucial factor for the changes in the party system. The two parties, once they begin to lose influence, they also lose the ability to deliver for clients. And then what is the point of voting for them in the first place? For the reasons that we're going to go into next. Next slide. So third, party and electoral legitimacy are key. It's important to note that the parties in Colombia are broadly speaking non-ideological. This is really crucial. They are organized ultimately around individuals. When those parties or individuals fail to deliver solutions to the persistent problems that Colombia has faced over the past 50 years, it's easy to look elsewhere in the end, because you're not really tied to an ideological vision of the country, you're tied to delivering practical solutions and the people who can do that. And we've seen just such a failure to deliver. We have also had instances of explicit power alternation between the liberals and conservatives, which I mentioned earlier, making it even harder to differentiate them at the time. In addition, Colombia has generally poor levels of state penetration in many areas of the country, making it easier than ever for the support of third parties to bloom if traditional benefits cannot be extracted from traditional parties. Finally, and this is a key point of difference between Colombia and Honduras, while Colombia has had some allegations of rigged elections, most elections are considered free and fair. In contrast, Honduras saw the deposition of President Zelaya in 2009, an event which many have labeled a coup, including Wikipedia. This was followed by a fraudulent election later in the year and allegations of rigging in 2013 and 2017, though 2021 was seen as pretty clean. Next slide. So the final factor that I want to unpack is charismatic leadership, and this is maybe the most transformative factor for the Colombian party system. In 2002, Alvaro Uribe ran not as a liberal, his traditional party with which he was affiliated, but as an independent. He further transformed the system by benefiting from a Supreme Court ruling, possibly the result of bribery, which allowed for his re-election in 2006 and strongly influenced the selection of his two successors, one of which he fell out with, as others have mentioned. So politics in many ways has become polarized in Colombia, not between liberals and conservatives, but between supporters of Uribe and his opponents. Similar dynamics have emerged around current President Petro, who has assembled a motley coalition not really based on ideology necessarily. I mean, like the conservatives and liberals have essentially been in every coalition over the past 20 years, but around his personality and reputation as an agent of change. In comparison, for the case of Honduras, President Zelaya of Honduras has also been a transformative figure, 100%. In 2013, his wife, Xiomara Castro, ran as the candidate of a new party, Libre. She didn't win, but she came second. And in 2021, she was successfully elected president as a candidate for that party, and they're now the largest party in Congress. So without Zelaya and Castro's backing, Libre would not have succeeded. So we've seen sort of the immense impact that just individuals can have on the strength of these parties because they are not super deeply rooted in a vision of the country. They're rooted in a vision of the individual. Next slide. So to conclude, I would like to say, circling back to my research question, that while the Colombian two-party system has certainly been extremely damaged for the reasons I just detailed, I also hesitate to say that it's entirely dead. Traditional parties retain influence and have not been totally replaced. Politics has also found new issues around which to polarize coalitions, if not parties. And perhaps the most key finding I want to highlight is the damage wrought by the non-ideological nature of Colombian parties, which has allowed their replacement by slightly more ideological but charismatic leaders willing to go it alone. All in all, the party system has faced many challenges, and as a result, it has been, if not broken, and in a way that looks very different from the case of Honduras, with important implications for future research as a result. Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna open it up for questions. Yes.
My question's kind of for the whole group, I don't know whoever wants to take it. You guys are all in varying ways talking about groups that are lacking political agency and the effects of that. I guess my question is given that with the migration and human rights abuses, do you see a path forward within Colombia and abroad, considering that migrants lack domestic and international political agency? Like, what is a good solution to addressing the concerns of a group that isn't going to generate a lot of political discourse internal to Colombia, and each country can kind of pass the buck on Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, or whoever? So like something like a key trend you guys think would be beneficial to addressing that?
To providing a sense of protection to
Sure, yeah.
migrants.
Or marginalized groups in general, it doesn't have to be just migrants.
I can speak briefly on sort of the role of marginalized groups. The marginalized groups and sort of the unheard were absolutely critical to Petro's his victory. He came to power off the backs of sort of these groups that have felt marginalized. The sort of rural poor, the poor in general, Afro-Colombians, LGBTQ minorities. But migrants are sort of a different case in that respect. Petro has certainly been vocal about wanting to protect those constituents, but migrants are also not constituents, really. They've stopped offering TPS to new arrivals, which was an extremely generous offer originally. But the politics of the issue have become such that I don't think that there's any benefit for any politician, as you noted, to really advocate strongly for them. I don't necessarily think that Colombia is going to decide to kick everyone out. I think that what's most likely is that the status quo, where things are sort of shakily tolerant of migrants, is going to continue. But I don't necessarily think that the situation is going to improve. I think it's really hard to find a politician who decided to act solely in the interest of migrants would be doing so not out of sort of the political interests. They would be doing so out of sort of generosity, I guess you would say. Yeah, passion.
I don't want to cut in too much into the humanitarian side of things, but it's very much tragic that they're often the most scapegoat people on earth. And I think the United States has a strong interest in trying to keep migrants in Colombia instead of coming to the Darien Gap. And if that means providing funding and supporting there, it seems like the United States, at least under this administration, is willing to do that. At least there's many complications to be had. But one thing that was interesting was talking about the difference between temporary protected status in Colombia versus asylum. With TPS, you can stay for 10 years and get access to many services that you can't necessarily and work, but you can't necessarily stay beyond that period, at least for right now. But with asylum, you can stay, but you can't necessarily access those services. So that's a really interesting problem, and I don't have exactly an answer, but it is an interesting dichotomy of how that affects migrants.
Yeah, I think also Colombia is just facing like an adjustment period because such a large influx of migrants, like they have never really been a recipient country before like 2016, 2018, around then. And then in terms of other vulnerable like minorities and populations, I think with the Petro administration, the recognition is great, but the realities of a lot of rural communities has not necessarily changed and has actually gotten worse. And so I think that's like a very, very large, difficult problem to solve, but it comes like my takeaway from the trip was that the first step to guaranteeing these human rights is human security. So it's like the hierarchy of needs, and you can't really get anywhere until you are like free and secure. So there's a lot of different political options like Petro's Paz Total or other ways that people have suggested going about that. Know what will work, but I think that nothing is really going to change until human security is achieved to a higher degree.
I think in my opinion it will eventually change, especially talking politically, just because locals are starting to realize how profitable the migration business is. And since migration is increasing, and it's going like through all the migration path, locals will start like locals in these areas will start voting for someone that is protecting these migrants and is actually like easing the process of like the migration route. So I think we'll see in the next couple of years, in the next presidential election, I guess, difference in votes and opinions on migration. Just because, as I said, like locals are starting to realize how profitable this business is, if that makes sense.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Go ahead. I don't know your name, sorry. Can we go?
Allie.
Allie, thank you for your great presentation. I believe Colombia is one of the few USAID missions which has an annual human rights consultation. Did they mention it when you were talking with them? And did they talk about at all the success or challenges of their funding, either through Comonics for Afro-Colombian organizations or the challenges of their work trying to help protect human rights defenders, since the record is so challenging?
So we did meet with both USAID and Comonics. They didn't mention anything about they didn't mention anything about particular reports, which now I'm going to look into that. But there was definitely a lot of talk about the difficulties of funding, and some talk about different programs, but we didn't really get into a lot of specifics about human rights defenders with the humanitarian organizations. I found that I spoke the most about the situation of human rights defenders with Insight Crime. They had a lot of insights just about the actual violations themselves and the regions in which they were occurring, why human rights defenders are maybe more salient and prevalent in indigenous communities that have a more unique, distinct, cohesive culture that's like different from a Colombian culture, and how that threatens maybe the armed groups in the areas. But we didn't necessarily get the humanitarian perspective on that.
So,
Scott, this question, I guess, would be for either Martha or Allie or both. Kind of dovetails off what Tully was talking about, but with the kind of politicization of humanitarian aid, how would you diagnose or kind of grade cooperation between Colombians on the kind of passage through there?
To start.
Yeah, I did really.
I just, it's tough to say because they have like so many different views on migration. Like Colombians, we have heard from Ali and we will more in with Chloe in her presentation, but Colombia has like this cultural history of like protecting migrants. Like Panama, for instance, for example, in the last week, they banned the operation of Doctors Without Borders in the other side of the Darien Gap, just because they were accusing the government of not doing enough. So it's kind of like there's no bilateral cooperation on the Darien as of now. Just this is my research. I'm not talking in the name of anyone. As I have seen on my research, there's no cooperation, and they have very different views on migration per se. So,
Really touched that too much in my research yet. So
sorry.
Better signature project.
no, it's fine.
Okay. You got a question?
Yeah, this question's for Finn. I wonder, just kind of out of curiosity, what you said, you mentioned it's bent, not broken in Colombia. I wonder what would the circumstances be for it to be broken regarding the two-party system? And then kind of some of the examples with Honduras and Colombia, you mentioned, I would say, are relatively contemporary with the current presidents. I wonder if any of the side or any of the previous literature you went through had any like examples of it coming full circle, where maybe like, you know, a two-party system was in place for a while, it broke down, and then eventually it started to come back.
That's an interesting question. I think you can look to the US for that, frankly, where the party, I think political scientists think we're in the sixth or seventh party system, which has always been a two-party system, but it sort of remakes itself every once in a while. I can't think of any other examples off the top of my head. I mean, occasionally you see this with just sort of, Canada has done this where parties will merge or sort of create new agglomerations of interest groups. But with regards to Colombia specifically, I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question? Oh, what would it take to break the party system? Probably
maybe not. Sorry, just to interrupt. Not what it would take to break it, but like, what do you think? What would it look like? Like,
I think it looks a lot like today. I think it just takes another electoral cycle. I just think it's. I was trained somewhat as a political scientist, so it's very difficult for me to make a sort of causal claim.
Right.
So it's hard for me to say that it's entirely broken. I think that there are still indicators that it's important, and that makes me hesitant to say that it's broken. I would say that if you have another election where they continue to be marginalized, they've been more and more marginalized each electoral cycle. Their influence was still pretty important throughout the early 2000s, but they've become more and more sort of on the outs. If the next election is really just like a Petro versus whomever show, I think you would have a very good case to say that the two-party system is completely broken. Because I think that politics has just gradually moved further and further away. I just hesitate to say that it's completely gone.
Yeah. One last question, David.
And it's a bit tangential too, so feel free to defer. But I'm curious how governance changed at this period before and after the scratch parties. Because part of me conjectures that it has become more difficult because you have to start building coalitions. But on the other hand, I could see if it's so individual, see a charismatic individual like maybe easily create a coalition together. I think I'm the one making what he's done. So I'm curious if you have researched that question, how that came up.
I mean, theoretically, it should be harder. Theoretically, coalitional systems should make governance like more slow, more difficult. I mean, there are examples where like this is not necessarily the case. Like Indonesia always creates a governing coalition which has like 500 out of 600 seats and includes everyone from every sort of ideological position. Colombia is not quite to that degree, but like Petro's current coalition is pretty disparate. They don't really have any ideological cohesion in Congress. So this can make things easier, but it can also make things harder. So at the beginning of the term, there was a lot of ambition that like, oh, he'll do health reform, he'll do pension reform, he'll do tax reform. He got tax reform, kind of, and he got some land reform, which is not nothing, but it's not what was promised. And then it's sort of the ideological wheels start to come off and he starts fighting with individual leaders. So I think it's made things harder because there used to be a traditional system where the big leader made the decision and he had already gained, and it was always a he had gained the support of the party to become the president or the leader of the party anyway, so they could manage the factions. And so the legislation was a little bit more formal, like more of a formality than it is today. Now it's quite difficult for the country to govern. Increasingly having to resort to sort of more executive prerogatives, but that's also kind of much the same in the United States. I'm not saying this is like a reflection on the Colombian system being awful or something. Like this is just a reality of coalitional governance, especially in a state with weak parties.
Oh, round of applause for everyone. Next week, where we'll have 2 other panels. Thank you very much for joining.
One's legacy lives on.
It's hard to bear.